At some point, you stopped being surprised by yourself. The same hesitation before certain decisions, the same pull toward the same kind of person, the same moment where something in you overrides what you actually wanted to do, and you let it, again, and file it under "that's just how I am." That phrase, "that's just how I am." You've used it as a conclusion when it was actually a surrender. How you are was built. It wasn't arrived at. It wasn't chosen after careful consideration of all available options. It was assembled, early, fast, and under conditions that required adaptation rather than authenticity. And what gets built under those conditions doesn't stay in the past. It stays in the behavior. It stays in the automatic reading you do of every room you walk into, every relationship you navigate, every version of yourself you decide is safe to show. Jung's work wasn't about pathology. It wasn't about what's wrong with people. It was about what runs inside them without their knowledge, the formations that operate with full consistency and zero transparency. You don't see them working, you only see their output, and their output looks from the inside exactly like personality. That's what this is about, something more specific than self-awareness in a general sense. The moment you stop mistaking your conditioning for your character. You've made decisions you understood completely in the moment, and then watched yourself move in a different direction anyway, not impulsively, not carelessly, with a kind of internal gravity that felt at the time like instinct, like the right read on the situation. And only later, sometimes much later, did it become clear that the reading was off, that what felt like perception was actually a reflex, that what felt like a choice had already been made somewhere you weren't watching. This is not a character flaw, it's a mechanism, and it has a precise name. Jung identified inside the psyche what he called complexes, not sensitivities, not insecurities, not emotional baggage in the loose way that term gets used. Complexes, in his framework, are autonomous formations. They consolidate around charged experience, moments of intense emotion, unresolved relational dynamics, conditions that required you to adapt faster than you could process. And once formed, they operate independently. They carry their own logic, their own triggers, their own behavioral momentum, and they activate not in response to what's actually in front of you, but in response to what the current situation resembles: a tone, a dynamic, a specific kind of pressure that maps onto something from much further back. The present moment becomes the occasion. Something older becomes the response. What makes this worth sitting with isn't the concept itself. It's what the concept implies about moments you've already lived. Every time a reaction arrived with more force than the situation warranted, every time you pulled back from something that, rationally, you had every reason to move toward. Every time you found yourself in a dynamic that felt familiar in a way you couldn't quite trace. Familiar not like comfort, but like repetition. Like a script you didn't write, but somehow knew all the lines to. Those weren't coincidences. They weren't moods. They were a formation inside you, executing its own logic in your name, with your face, in your relationships. The reason this is difficult to catch in real time is that a complex doesn't feel foreign when it fires. It feels like you. It feels like a legitimate read on what's happening. The emotional charge that arrives with it doesn't register as distortion. It registers as information, as a precise read on the situation, on the other person, on what needs to happen next. This is the operational reality of a complex. It doesn't announce itself as something other than you. It announces itself as the truth of the situation, and that disguise is not accidental. It's structural. The complex formed at an age when you had no framework to separate your experience from reality, when what happened around you and what you concluded about yourself and the world were the same thing. That fusion never fully dissolved. It just went underground and kept functioning. What that produces over time, not in theory but in actual lived experience, is a pattern. The same category of relational difficulty keeps surfacing across different people, different contexts, different years of your life. The specific way a certain kind of dynamic finds you, or you find it, with a consistency that eventually becomes impossible to explain through circumstance alone. The cast changes, the dynamic doesn't. And somewhere in you there's already a quiet acknowledgement of that. You've seen the pattern. You've named it, maybe. What you haven't yet fully faced is that the pattern isn't coming from outside you. It's being generated from inside by something that has never been directly examined, only continuously expressed. This channel exists for exactly this kind of examination. If something in what's being said is already mapping onto something specific in your life, subscribe. What comes next doesn't get more comfortable, it gets more precise. There's a version of control that looks from the outside like stability, and from the inside like enormous effort. You've been maintaining something, a particular way of operating, measured, contained, consistent. You don't overreact. You don't make demands. You don't let what's happening inside you become visible in ways that would complicate the situation. You've developed a considerable capacity to hold things in place, and you've come to identify that capacity as one of your strengths, maybe even as proof that you've worked on yourself, that you're self-aware, that you've moved beyond the kind of reactivity that less examined people display. What you haven't fully accounted for is where everything you've been holding actually goes. Jung borrowed a term from Heraclitus for this, enantiodromia, the principle that anything pushed far enough in one direction will eventually generate its opposite with equal force, not as a philosophical abstraction, as a psychological law. The psyche doesn't tolerate permanent suppression. What gets consistently held down doesn't dissolve from the pressure. It consolidates under it. It builds density, and at some point, not predictably, not on a schedule you can manage, it breaks through. And when it does, it doesn't arrive proportionately. It arrives with the full accumulated weight of everything that was kept from expressing itself. You've seen this in yourself. The patience that held for weeks and then collapsed over something genuinely small. The calm that maintained through every significant difficulty and then shattered at something that, by any reasonable measure, shouldn't have warranted the response it got. The rationality that governed every major decision and then went entirely absent in a moment that needed it most. You explained those moments away afterward. Stress, exhaustion, an exception. But they weren't exceptions. They were the return of everything the control had been deferring. And this is where it becomes more than an observation about emotional regulation. Because enantiodromia doesn't only operate in acute moments, it operates across longer timelines, in subtler forms, in the places where the suppression has been most sustained. The person who has spent years being endlessly accommodating, who has made an identity out of not needing, not asking, not imposing, will find at some point that the unexpressed need doesn't stay unexpressed. It expresses itself sideways, in resentment that has no single addressable source, in a growing internal withdrawal from relationships that, on the surface, are entirely functional, in the specific exhaustion of someone who has been giving from a place that was never being replenished, and who can no longer locate the motivation to keep the performance going. The suppressed thing doesn't announce its return. You don't get a warning that the balance is about to shift. What you get instead is a gradual change in the quality of your own inner experience, a heaviness that wasn't there before, or an irritability that seems disproportionate to your actual circumstances, or a flatness in areas of your life that used to carry some genuine charge. These aren't symptoms of something external going wrong. They're the signal that something internal has been accumulating past the point where maintenance alone can contain it. What makes this particularly precise is that the thing being suppressed is almost never arbitrary. It's not random content that got pushed down by accident. It's specific. It's usually something that, at a particular point in your development, was experienced as incompatible with the version of yourself that was required in your environment. Too much, too intense, too demanding, too vulnerable, too inconvenient for the dynamic you were living inside. So it went underground, and the version of you that remained above ground learned to function without it, learned to call that absence maturity or discipline or growth. But the psyche doesn't register absence as growth. It registers it as debt, and debt, left long enough without any acknowledgement, begins to collect interest in forms you didn't agree to pay. You know what you're good at, not in an arrogant way, in a functional way. You've identified over time the mode of operating that works for you, the way you process information, make decisions, read situations, navigate complexity, whether it's through rigorous analysis or through pattern recognition or through relational attunement or through direct action. You have a dominant way of engaging with the world, and it's served you. It's produced real results. It's become, in many ways, the core of how you understand yourself. What you haven't fully examined is what that dominance costs. Jung mapped the psyche across 4 fundamental functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, not as personality traits, as modes of processing reality. Every person has access to all 4, but not equally. One function becomes primary, refined through use, trusted, relied upon. Another becomes secondary, and the remaining 2, particularly the one sitting directly opposite the dominant function, remain undeveloped. Raw, unintegrated, operating not with the sophistication of the conscious personality, but with the bluntness of something that was never given the chance to mature. He called it the inferior function. And inferior here doesn't mean weak in a simple sense. It means primitive. It means that in this specific domain, you are not the person you are everywhere else. The same individual who operates with precision, nuance, and composure in their dominant mode, that person, when pushed into the territory of their inferior function, becomes reactive, disproportionate, oddly rigid, vulnerable in ways that don't match anything else about them. You've encountered this. There's a specific category of situation where something in you stops working the way it normally does, where the competence that defines you in other areas becomes suddenly unavailable, and what takes its place is something that feels embarrassingly underdeveloped for someone of your experience and self-awareness. The analytical person who, in emotional confrontation, goes completely flat, unable to access anything useful, reduced to either shutdown or overcorrection. The deeply feeling person who, the moment precision and logic are required, becomes paralyzed by a kind of internal noise that won't resolve into anything actionable. The intuitive person who, when asked to deal with concrete material reality, logistics, physical details, immediate sensory demands, becomes irritable and disoriented in a way that seems entirely out of character. It seems out of character because it is. The inferior function doesn't belong to the same personality that operates everywhere else. It belongs to a part of the psyche that never received the development, the practice, the refinement that the dominant function did. And when life forces you into its territory, when circumstances demand exactly the mode of engagement that you're least equipped to provide, the inferior function doesn't rise to the occasion. It regresses. It pulls the entire personality down with it into a register that is, in Jung's precise language, archaic, driven by emotion where there should be thought, driven by rigidity where there should be flexibility, driven by a kind of primitive certainty that would be unrecognizable to the version of you operating at full capacity. What makes this more than a theoretical map of your psychology is this: your inferior function is not only the place where you're most vulnerable, it's the place you're most likely to be triggered, most likely to make decisions you'll later revise, and most likely to misjudge both yourself and others. And because it operates with such a different quality than your usual mode, you rarely recognize it in the moment. You experience the inferior function not as a lapse in your normal functioning. You experience it as a sudden, unusually strong conviction, a certainty that feels almost moral in its intensity, a sharpness that seems to cut through everything else. That intensity is not a sign that you've accessed something true. It's a sign that you've fallen into the least developed part of yourself and mistaken the emotional charge for reliability. The strongest hold the inferior function has over you is precisely in the moments you feel most sure. There came a point where you stopped building an identity and started being it. That transition didn't feel like a problem when it happened. It felt like arrival, like the uncertainty of earlier years had finally resolved into something stable, a clear sense of who you are, what you stand for, what kind of person you've become. You earned that sense of self. It came from real experience, real effort, real decisions made under real pressure. And so it hardened, not into rigidity, you told yourself, into conviction, into knowing yourself well enough to stop second-guessing every internal signal. What hardens, though, doesn't only protect, it also closes. Jung observed a phenomenon he called psychological inflation, and it operates in precisely the territory of people who have done genuine work on themselves. It isn't the inflation of the arrogant or the oblivious. It's the inflation of the capable. It happens when the ego, the conscious sense of self, begins to identify not just with who you are, but with an image of who you are, an ideal, a role, a particular way of being that has become so central to your self-concept that defending it and defending yourself have become the same gesture. The difference between having values and being inflated by them is subtle but consequential. A person with genuine values can afford to be wrong. They can afford to encounter information that contradicts their self-image without experiencing that contradiction as a threat to their fundamental coherence. The inflated ego cannot do this. When the self-concept has expanded to fill the entire available psychological space, when the image of who you are has become indistinguishable from who you actually are, then any challenge to the image registers as an attack on something essential. And the response is not curiosity, it is defense. You've felt this not as defensiveness in the obvious sense, but in a subtler form. The specific internal resistance that arrives when someone reads you in a way that doesn't match how you read yourself. The discomfort that comes not from being criticized, but from being seen differently than you see yourself. The conversations where you found yourself working harder than the situation warranted to correct an impression, not because the impression was damaging, but because it didn't align with the internal image. That effort, that particular compulsion to be understood in a specific way, is the inflated ego maintaining its territory. And territory maintenance is expensive. It requires constant monitoring. Every interaction becomes, in part, an audit of whether the image is holding. Every relationship carries a background question. Does this person see me the way I need to be seen? Every piece of feedback gets filtered through a prior commitment to a particular conclusion about yourself, which means that feedback, however accurate, rarely lands fully. It gets accepted where it confirms and deflected where it complicates. Over time, this produces a specific kind of isolation, not from people, but from the information that would allow genuine development. The inflated self-concept functions as a ceiling. Growth is welcome up to the point where it would require the image to change. At that point, it stops, What makes inflation particularly difficult to examine is that the image it's built around is usually real. You are in many ways the person you believe yourself to be. The qualities you've identified in yourself are genuine. The self-concept didn't form out of nothing. It formed from actual experience, actual evidence, actual patterns of behavior over time. The inflation doesn't lie about the qualities. It lies about their completeness. It takes what is real and partial and treats it as total. It takes a genuine aspect of who you are and expands it until it accounts for everything, until the parts of you that don't fit the image become invisible, not because they're absent, but because the image has no room for them. And those parts don't disappear from having no room. They accumulate pressure and find other exits. There's something you've been trying to do for a long time, and it has never fully worked. Not because you've been doing it wrong, but because what you've been attempting isn't actually possible in the way you've been approaching it. The effort itself is the problem. The belief that the tension you live with, between who you are and who you sense you could be, between what you want and what you've built, between the person your environment shaped and the one that keeps pressing against that shape from the inside. The belief that this tension is a problem requiring a solution has kept you in a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of effort has been able to resolve. Jung identified a function of the psyche that he considered one of the most significant and least understood: the transcendent function. Not transcendent in a spiritual sense, precise in a psychological one. It describes the mind's capacity to hold two opposing forces in simultaneous awareness without collapsing into either one and without forcing a resolution that the situation hasn't genuinely produced. What emerges from that sustained tension, when it's held rather than escaped, is something that neither pole could have generated alone. Not a compromise, not a synthesis arrived at intellectually. Something that arises from the confrontation itself, from the willingness to remain inside the discomfort of two things being true at once. Very few people ever access this, and the reason isn't lack of intelligence or lack of self-awareness. It's a much more immediate problem. The discomfort of unresolved tension is nearly intolerable to the ego. The ego is an organizing structure. Its entire function is to produce coherence, a stable, legible narrative about who you are and how the world works. Contradiction threatens that coherence directly, and so the moment real tension appears, the moment two genuine but incompatible things press against each other with equal force, the ego moves immediately toward resolution. Not because resolution is available, but because the alternative sitting inside the irresolution feels like a kind of psychological emergency. You know what this looks like in practice. It looks like deciding too quickly, collapsing a genuine complexity into the option that produces the fastest internal relief, regardless of whether that option is actually adequate to the situation. It looks like the explanation you reach for in the middle of a difficult conversation, not because the explanation is complete, but because the uncertainty of not yet having one is producing a pressure you can't sustain. It looks like the conviction that arrives fully formed in the moments of highest internal conflict, the certainty that feels like resolution, but is actually just the ego selecting one side of the tension and suppressing the other hard enough that the suppressed side temporarily stops being audible, and then it becomes audible again. It always does. Because the tension wasn't resolved, it was interrupted. The two opposing forces are still there, still generating pressure, still requiring something from you that a premature conclusion couldn't provide. And you return to the same conflict, slightly more exhausted, slightly less trusting of your own capacity to navigate it, slightly more inclined toward the shortcut of false resolution the next time the pressure builds. What the transcendent function requires is the one thing the ego finds most threatening: The willingness to not know for longer than is comfortable, without filling the not knowing with the first available answer. To hold the fact that you are, genuinely, both things. That the contradiction you keep trying to resolve is not a malfunction of your self-understanding. It's an accurate perception of something real inside you. The analyst and the feeling person. The one who needs connection and the one who needs solitude. The one who has built carefully and the one who senses that the building is incomplete. Both of these are true. The work is not to choose between them. The work is to remain inside their opposition long enough for something that belongs to neither pole, something that could only emerge from the confrontation itself to become visible. That emergence can't be forced, it can't be scheduled, it can't be produced by thinking harder about the problem. What it requires is a particular quality of attention, not active, not passive, but receptive. The capacity to observe what's happening inside without immediately moving to manage it. To notice the tension without treating the noticing as the beginning of a resolution process. This is not inaction. It is, in fact, one of the most demanding things the psyche can be asked to do, because it requires holding open a space that every instinct you have will want to close. The person who develops this capacity doesn't become someone without conflict. They become someone whose conflicts begin to generate something other than exhaustion. You've noticed it. You may not have said it out loud, but you've noticed it. A particular kind of situation keeps returning. Not the surface details. Those change. The people are different, the context is different, the specific circumstances carry enough variation that each instance feels, when you're inside it, like something new. But underneath the variation, the shape is the same. The same dynamic, the same role you find yourself occupying, the same emotional register. The same point in the progression where something shifts in a direction you didn't want, in a way you couldn't quite stop, even when part of you saw it coming. And afterward, the same private acknowledgement, quiet, uncomfortable, filed away quickly, that this has happened before. Jung called this constellation, the process by which a complex, once activated, begins organizing the external environment around its own logic, not metaphysically. Psychologically, through the specific choices, signals, and behavioral patterns that the activated complex generates without conscious participation. You move towards certain situations. You read certain people in ways that confirm what the complex already believes. You respond to dynamics in ways that invite the very development the complex is structured around. The external world doesn't conspire to repeat your patterns. You bring the pattern to the external world, and the world, being full of people and situations with their own corresponding structures, meets you there. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The immediate response is resistance, a reasonable-sounding argument that the pattern isn't internal, that the situations really are similar because they belong to a similar category of life circumstance, that other people's behavior is genuinely the primary variable. That argument isn't entirely wrong. Other people do carry their own structures. External circumstances do have real properties. But the argument misses the part that's within reach, the part that, if examined, would actually change something. Because the question isn't whether the external world contributed to the pattern, the question is, what in you selected for it? What in you recognized it before it was fully visible and moved toward it anyway? What in you, in the earliest moments of a dynamic, was already orienting around a familiarity that had nothing to do with the present moment? Familiarity is the key word. The complex doesn't lead you toward what you want. It leads you toward what it recognizes. And what it recognizes is the emotional territory it was formed inside, not because that territory was pleasant, but because it is known. The psyche, in the absence of conscious direction, defaults toward the known. Known discomfort carries less uncertainty than unknown possibility. A dynamic you've navigated before, even badly, even at real cost, produces less internal alarm than a genuinely unfamiliar one. And so you return, not deliberately, not even fully consciously, but with a consistency that, viewed from enough distance, reveals itself as a preference, a deeply held, entirely unconscious preference for the conditions that allow the complex to keep doing what it has always done. What changes this isn't awareness alone. Awareness of a pattern is the beginning of something, but it is not the thing itself. You can see a pattern with complete lucidity and still enact it, because seeing it doesn't automatically interrupt the mechanism that produces it. What actually interrupts the mechanism is something more specific and more demanding, the capacity to catch the moment of orientation, not after the dynamic has already formed, not in the aftermath, when the familiar outcome has once again arrived, but in the early moment, the moment of initial recognition, the moment where something in you says, "I know this," and to treat that recognition not as a green light, but as a signal to pause, to ask what exactly is being recognized, and whether what's being recognized belongs to the present situation, or to something the present situation has simply agreed to stand in for. That pause is not natural. It runs directly against the momentum of the complex, which moves fast, which feels certain, which presents its conclusions as perceptions rather than interpretations. Developing the capacity to insert that pause, not to stop living, not to approach every new situation with suspicion, but to introduce a moment of genuine inquiry between the recognition and the response, is one of the most consequential things a person can do with their psychology. Because it doesn't just change a single outcome. It begins, slowly and without drama, to change what the pattern can find in you to work with. I've spent a long time observing these patterns, in what I've read, in what I've watched, and in the parts of my own behavior that took years to become legible to me. And what I keep coming back to isn't the complexity of Jung's framework or the elegance of the theory. It's something simpler and harder: how long a person can live in full proximity to their own patterns and still not see them clearly. Not because they're not looking, but because the looking itself is being done by the part of the psyche that the pattern built. The observer and the observed are the same formation, and that's not a problem you solve with more information. It's a problem you solve by developing a different quality of attention, slower, less invested in confirming what you already believe about yourself, more willing to let what's actually there become visible, even when what's actually there is inconvenient. You've just spent time inside something that most people spend their entire lives walking around. The information was always available. What was never guaranteed was the willingness to sit inside it, to let it land without immediately converting it into something manageable. This required that, and the fact that you stayed says something about where you are right now, not as a compliment, as an observation. What's worth asking yourself now, not rhetorically but as a genuine inquiry you carry with you after this ends, is this: what pattern in your life has been consistent enough and costly enough that you can no longer attribute it entirely to circumstance? What reaction do you keep having that arrives with more force than the moment warrants? And what does that force tell you about where it actually comes from? And the one that cuts deepest: what version of yourself have you been defending so consistently that you've stopped being able to distinguish the defense from the identity? These aren't questions with clean answers. They're questions that, if held seriously, begin to change the quality of your own self-observation. They move you from watching the surface of your behavior to watching the mechanism underneath it. That shift is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. But it is, without question, where anything real begins. If this kind of examination is something you want to keep doing, if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology of how you actually operate, not how you believe you operate, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This is not a place for motivation or reassurance. It's a place for precision, and there's considerably more to come. Some things once seen with this kind of attention don't allow the same quality of unconsciousness again.